It's Mark.
Mark, to remember
Hager.
that,
I love that before it came into the room, Brenda says to me, I don't think I have 5 minutes worth of material.
I'm such a bad academic.
Awesome, thank you. Hi there, I'm Mark Hager from Arizona State University. And I say it's a little daunting to be in a session where it's sort of about history and have Roseanne dig in and start talking about history and have your name come up. So it's a little weird. I still think of myself as that young guy, you know, trying to figure things out. And then you wake up and you realize that you've been to 26 ARNOVAs and, you know, and so I will say though that, and maybe because my first ARNOVA was in 1995, I cut into an ARNOVA that didn't really have sections or didn't emphasize sections. And I've always been, either because of my interests or whatever, just sort of been able to attach to the ARNOVA mothership in productive ways. And I've never really gravitated towards the sections, dabbled a little bit around with the finance group. And now this is the third time that TIBS has invited me to come participate in a plenary. And that's awesome, but I've never paid any TIBS dues, so I should maybe think about that. I should get my $12 out right now. Right? But as the sections go, I mean, there are lots of different things that I'm interested in, and if any of you know any Mark Hager stories, it's probably some piece of things I'm interested in, and some of those are very, very, very focused, detailed, you know, managerial kinds of things. But I like to use part of my sort of professional mind, also thinking pretty broadly about the field and about the boundaries of the field, and maybe I don't know what all motivated Brenda, Roseanne, Felice to invite me to be that young guy back in 2004.
We were Aspen Institute fellows together, doing all this great stuff on the ARNOVA listserv. He put himself out there on the ARNOVA listserv and all these major debates with senior scholars.
So the breadth is at least interesting to me. So, you know, whether I have anything to say, you know, it's always you leave that up to history, but you know, I was at least able to be in the mix with those kinds of interests. Prepared a few thoughts and thinking back to those very early days. I brought 2 visual aids with me on the plane, got them all prepared, and then I left them in my hotel room. So you're just going to have to pretend you see the 2 visual aids that I brought with me. The first, I'm holding up a 2002 Montreal ARNOVA bag. And I go back to 2002 much for the same reason that Roseanne did in her remarks. I'm remembering sitting in a ARNOVA plenary. I don't even know I still have those kinds of things where you invite everybody to, you know, one big speaker or one big panel. I guess we do. In 2002, it was a guy that some of you will have heard of. Roseanne mentioned him, a guy named Henry Mintzberg, a rather famous organizational theorist at McGill University. So he's a Canadian scholar, and we're in Montreal, so it made sense to invite Henry Mintzberg to come to talk to us. Just out of interest, sitting home preparing my remarks, I'm like, whatever happened to Henry Mintzberg? How old is that guy anyway? Well, he's in his early 80s, and he's still an active scholar listed on the McGill website as teaching courses. I followed him a little bit. He is regularly posting on Twitter. The content that his Twitter profile is much more active than me. So Henry Mintzberg is still out there doing it. Never known as a nonprofit guy. He's not published in the nonprofit journal. He's a management guy and a known scholar back in 2003, and we'll go down in history in that way. But we invited him to come talk to us because of his fame. And I was sitting by Pam Leland. I'll start dropping a few names into our history, I guess, a little bit. Pam Leland is a person worth referring to, and we're watching Henry Mintzberg. And Henry gives his talk, and it ends up becoming important to TIBS because Henry put a charge to us. He says, you know, I think you ought to think about what you call these things that you study. I think nonprofit organization carries some baggage. Why don't you, and he talked about this much more eloquently and in great length, and he settled down into, hey, all of you out there in ARNOVA land, and it was very well attended. We were all in the audience. You should call these things social sector organizations operating in a social sector. And, that's provocative. Certainly it's nice to hear that, but not everybody reacted very positively to that. I think partly because we're our own association of people who pay attention to nonprofit organizations. And I remember Pam in particular looked at me and she's kind of like, who is this guy telling us what we ought to be studying? But it was influential. I mean, certainly we use the term now, whether that's due to Henry, to Professor Mintzberg or not, I couldn't say, but it certainly influenced police, I think, in thinking about the formation of the sector. And I called attention to this in my remarks back in 2004. So now this is me holding up my 2004 ARNOVA bag that we got in Los Angeles at the time. That was a momentous meeting. I have a number of memories from 2004. I don't remember anything about 2003 or 2005, but somehow 2004 had a lot of interesting things going on in it. Theory-wise, I presented a paper in a session that almost nobody attended, where for the first time I presented sort of a dumbed down circular model of organizations' responses to the public and how that might affect their reporting in public regulatory documents. And sort of laid fallow for a while. We picked up something I'd never published too much from it. And 5 years later, who was it? Do I have names here? Ann Gregory, John Howard, a couple of consultants picked it up and sort of represented as something called the starvation cycle. And they sort of refer to this stuff obliquely in the footnotes, right? But they get a lot of heyday out of this starvation cycle idea. But that was presented at the 2004 meeting, where everything broadly about sort of what this, we called it a circle, they called it a cycle, might look like. But I wasn't at TIBS to talk about the circle. I was there because I was invited to sort of supplement Roger Lohman's remarks on sort of a division, if you will. This division goes back much further than 2004, as people told me the history, Felice and Eleanor. It goes back to the very early days where the people that are sort of creating ARNOVA, and I'm not a historian, I'm probably not the one to tell these stories, but it comes out of more of a focus on what we call voluntary action. It's mostly sociology and community scholars that are thinking in very interpretive, qualitative ways, case studies about our communities and how work gets done in our communities. And that's found in the original name. We're talking about voluntary action scholars and do I have this in my note? I mean, the original journal was called the Journal, somebody help me out, Journal of Voluntary Action Scholarship or something like that. So, I mean, just focused on the VA and Journal of Voluntary Action Studies. Thank you, right? But the emphasis on the VA, right? The VA is there from the beginning. And I was talking a little bit with Karl Malofsky just yesterday about some of these early days, and he refers to just a handful of scholars. Elizabeth, are you back with us? You sometimes will talk about David Mason's ranch and the meetings that happened there. And Karl referred to, first, I've never really heard about Thomasina Borkman's role in sort of trying to corral different interests that were coming into these ranks as the association started to grow. And the main rank is, and Karl characterized these as the economists. I've sort of always thought of them more as sort of organizational scholars writ large, or coming in with sort of a different focus, different point of view, different methodologies compared to the voluntary action scholars that had founded ARNOVA. And Karl, I wish he was in the room, said that Thomasina Borkman kneecapped everyone And I think what he meant by that is that you get these factions, these two different groups, the voluntary action scholars on the VA side and the nonprofit organizations on the NO side, who have a very sort of vying for what is the association going to be about. And Thomasina played a major role in how I'm understanding the story and sort of, calming the waters or refereeing how this was going to fall out. It's got to be about that time the association recognizes that it's not just about voluntary action scholarship anymore. And we get a name change. Now we have both the VA and the NO that are recognized in the name of the association, and we change the name of the journal as well to nonprofit voluntary, whatever NVSQ stands for. So this changes sort of recognize this. And so I'm asked to come on to represent NO. We have, established long-term Roger Lohman, well-known theorist. He had published a book called The Commons, which established him as a, well-known scholar on the VA side. And I'm just some kid asked to come in and to represent the NO side. I mapped out a few themes about NO in that 2004 address, and I don't want to pour through those themes here. I'll at least mention them. One theme was on whether we should be content to call these things nonprofit organizations. It was the issue that Henry Mintzberg had raised, and I thought it was an important question, was in the water at the time. I don't hear it so much these days. You hear it a little bit, the shortcomings of the term nonprofit organization, some of the alternatives we might talk about, and we talked through them in my address. I mean, there's some important terms there that we could use as alternatives, and we sometimes use them: charitable, third, civil, independent, voluntary, philanthropic. And so why do we settle on nonprofit organization? Do we like that? What does it mean that we call these? We're sort of gathering around this term nonprofit organizations. And are we okay with that? Another thing we talked about in that address back in 2004 were about the boundaries of the sector and sort of a main distinction between public service nonprofits on the one hand, which are sometimes called the charitables, or those that are exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, and an entirely different group of the mutual benefit organizations, or the non-charitables, or the 501c3 other organizations. So sort of a major distinction of boundaries in the field of it. Are we all of that? Are we going to be everything that's non-business and non-government? Is that what falls to us? And so it's talking about that boundary field. The third, and I think this is the last one I'll mention, was a favorite of sector historian Peter Dobkin Hall, who died in 2015. And in the book that he published around that time, or a few years earlier, he really focused on this idea of sector. What does it mean that we're gathering under an idea of sector, pulling not only all of those public sector and member benefit serving organizations all under one umbrella, but what about the diversity of organizations? Does it make sense to put the hospital and the Little League and the opera and the neighborhood watch association all under one big umbrella and call it association? What does it mean to call it a sector? And so this is pretty new for us to think about it in terms of one sector. And so we kicked that around a little bit in the address that I had in 2004. So I don't know how much those resonate today. I'm sort of uncertain about the currency of those debates in 2001. They tend to still resonate with me, but I kind of have a long view, and still we'll sort of talk about those in the graduate courses that I have. But I think the field has gravitated to new questions over time. Some of these things, questions about what do we call these things and where are the distinctions, they either matter less or we start to ask new questions, or the field adjusts. One big difference, I think, between 2004 and now is that the field of public administration has made a much greater presence and claim on the field than we had back in the day. When in my early days of ARNOVA, there's a smattering of public administration scholars that are no more weighty than, than economists or sociologists or political scientists. And, everybody is reasonably happy with that. But now, there's a gorilla in the realm of public administration, and that I think influences the kinds of questions that we collectively ask in our ARNOVA universe. So I'm sort of immersed in my own micro questions now. I'm unsure sort of where the big questions are. Maybe I should come to more TIBS plenaries and I'll get, a little more familiar with all of this stuff. But I have this suspicion, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you'll correct me, that we're a little less introspective about these big questions of boundaries now collectively in ARNOVA than we might have been in 2004 or going further back. So I sort of wonder about that. I had fun giving that address in 2004. It made me feel important as a young man. So thank you to all of you. I remember standing up at the end. Roger and I both got up, and it was neat to give this presentation with Roger. And I sort of went over to a side of the room so I could stand prominently in case anybody wanted to come over and talk to me, and people wanted to. That was kind of cool. There was like 4 people deep. I know the 4th person back was in the back, and she was really making eye contact. She's like, I really have a burning question I would like to ask you. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take these one at a time. I talked to the first person for a little while and had this great conversation. I talked to the second person, and she's still back there. And she's like, I really would like to chat with you. And I talked to the third person for a while, and finally she gets up here and she says, Dr. Hager, I just want to tell you that your fly is down.